clarification, I am not the director of the water school. I'm director of the Vester Field Station underneath the water school. So Greg Tolley is the executive director of the water school. So if you have any issues, concerns, or anything about the water school, please send them to Greg. So, I picked this title slide because of the numbers. And so really what, if I could summarize what the task force is ultimately concentrating on, it would be data and the numbers. What are the data telling us? So, and as I go through some of the summaries of our most recent meetings, I'll try to reiterate where this comes up. So next slide, please. So just as a refresher, the Blue-Green Algae Task Force was put together in May of 2019 under the direction and of Governor DeSantis. We work closely with the Department of Environmental Protection, as Ed mentioned, and Mark Rains is our main contact and liaison with the Department of Environmental Protection. Next slide. So there are 5 members of the task force. So the 5 are listed here. And so we have pretty much coverage in South Florida. And I'm our sole Southwest Florida representative here. So everyone else is primarily Central and East Coast. But it's a good team. We all bring in different points of view and different expertise that I think is really useful. Next slide, please. So as everyone's familiar with, back in 2019, we came up with a list of recommendations that we sent to the governor's office in fall of 19, and he met with different legislature representatives, leadership, as well as DEP, Department of Health representatives, DAX representatives, and really wanted to see these recommendations moving forward. So we had different topics. You can see them all listed here, and I'll talk a little bit about some of our progress to date. And ultimately, these were incorporated into the Clean Waterways Act in 2020. And so that was pretty much the first and I guess heaviest lift that the state has done from a legislative point of view in terms of our recommendations. And so basically what we've been doing is working with Department of Environmental Protection, Department of Health, and Agriculture and Consumer Services to see what kind of progress has been made with the Clean Waterways Act, as well as what they could do in-house without the need of any legislative changes. So the next several slides will just kind of give you a summary of what we've done pretty much since last summer. So I think it's July 20, it looks like I got a typo on there, but it should be July 2021 on the next slide. Next slide, please. So again, this should be July 2021. So it's, I guess, convenient that Ed just gave a good overview of what DEP is doing in terms of innovative technologies. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here is almost a year old now, because this was from the 2021 June 2021 meeting. But basically, we had agencies that came and talked about the Innovative Technologies Grants Program. Ed gave a presentation, for example. There was also talk about the network expansion, the monitoring network expansion on Lake Okeechobee. So basically adding more sampling stations as well as more sensors, so on and so forth, to get more data and more strategic data coming in from Lake Okeechobee. So for example, South Florida Water Management working with the DEP, so there would be less duplication of efforts, for example, and more kind of combining forces to get better coverage. There was also talk with the cyanobacteria control. Ed gave a great overview of that right before me here. TF stands for the task force. So we discussed the following based on these presentations. We were wondering how the technology performance was going to be evaluated, what basically dictated success versus non-success, I guess would be one way of saying it. And a need of monitoring these different technologies, especially in the field. And as Ed mentioned, several different grants have been awarded to various university and other nonprofit and government agencies to basically test out these different technologies. And so we were, really interested in how the performance was evaluated, especially in terms of maybe some of the unintended consequences. So one example would be if pH would be affected by things like changing reactive oxygen species with adding hydrogen peroxide and things like that, for example. There are limitations of some technologies. Again, as Ed mentioned here, one that we focused on was treating algae at depth, because some of the technologies that have been out there would basically be a surface application and may not be effective with many of the cyanobacteria that would be migrating up and down in the water column and maybe at mid-water or even bottom waters in the water column. And the other part of this is, in particular with cyanobacteria, and Barry Rosen might talk about this a little bit later, even if you remove 95% of the algae, that population that's left can re-bloom, if you will. And, the problem wasn't really addressed in that way. So how effective can some of these technologies be? Is 95% removal good enough? Or do we really need to shoot for 99.99%? And is that feasible? And then we also reiterated that nutrient loading should be addressed first, because all we're really dealing with the symptoms of nutrient loading, and that's going to be just a recurring problem if we still have all these nutrient inputs going into these systems. Next slide, please. Our next meeting was a couple months later in August then, and so this was basically looking at stormwater and some of the recommendations by the Stormwater Technical Advisory Committee. And you can see just a couple of things mentioned here. If you want to see the document, there's the website address there. And one thing that we were focusing on would be that there still is a lot of dependence on presumed compliance. And so when you look at some of these systems on paper, they say they should be performing at this level, and they may not necessarily be performing as shown on paper. And so we really do need to get some data on how well these are performing. And as I know I talked with Roland about this before, maybe even a couple of years ago, but once systems are put in place, as they age, their performance really goes down. Just like people, as we get older, we perform less, I guess. But some of these systems, they're going to be underperforming, and they may actually become a nutrient source rather than a nutrient sink. And so the TAC really didn't address that in the documents that we were provided. It was mainly for new construction. So how are we going to address these older systems? And that's a pretty heavy lift. And how many storm ponds, retention ponds are there in the state, and how many are underperforming, if you will? So that's a pretty heavy lift to look at. But there is a need for monitoring these systems. We really won't be able to truly assess the breadth or the scope of the problem unless we get some numbers on these and really just get it all collated together to see what we're really dealing with. By not knowing or sticking our head in the sand is not really doing us any justice here. Next slide, please. Our next meeting was in December, so we looked at data collection and predictive modeling. So there was an overview by Blake Schaefer from US EPA about one of their cyanobacteria models. And they're basically also looking at this for Florida, as well as some other modeling efforts to develop a forecasting model. So the idea here would be, can we basically get ahead of these cyanobacteria blooms, and maybe we can actually start mitigation or control actions before the bloom becomes too big. Next slide, please. So we were wondering how other states might be using the model output. And a lot of these models are built with hindcasting and basically a calibration model. if you will, but what is the true forecasting performance of these models? And that is, basically a problem with a lot of these models in general would be how well can they truly forecast ahead of time. In fact, I'm working on a model right now for another harmful algal bloom species, and we're really trying to push that forecasting envelope out. And it's a challenge. It's not an easy thing to do, but that's what we really need to be better prepared and be proactive against this. But again, the other thing here is, we really need to address the nutrient inputs because, ultimately that's the issue here. So just constantly dealing with the algal problem over time really doesn't get to the source. We also talked a little bit about how satellites really only pick up the surface. And so they're not going to be giving us any data on what's lurking below the surface. This is also true for red tide. I know a couple of years ago we were out sampling and we first detected the bloom in about 4 meters of water. So it was subsurface where we saw the biggest concentrations of Corynea cells. And so, in cases like that, it's not going to be picked up by the satellites. And so you can see just some of the other things here. Hurricanes and other acute events are probably a huge driver in terms of some of these really large cyanobacteria blooms. And so we were wondering how that would be incorporated in the model, because these are huge events, as we all know, lots of rainfall, lots of mixing and stirring up sediment-bound nutrients. And so, that's something that really should be addressed. And then we were wondering what were the data gaps in the needs. Again, coming back to these numbers, what are some strategic uses of resources to get better data? Because the model is only going to be as good as the data that's being input into the model. Next slide, please. Next, this past February, we talked about sewage treatment and disposal systems. A lot of this focused on the septic to sewer conversions. So there were grants included in the Clean Waterways Act, for example, and funding to do some of these conversions. But as is similar with our retention ponds, there are a lot of septic tanks in Florida. Do we need to convert them all over to sewer? No, we don't. And it's, there are many places that are remote enough where that's not even possible. So how do we prioritize these? Where is it going to be appropriate to consider this? And so there was also some input from the Office of Environmental Accountability and Transparency, basically what role they were playing in facilitating a lot of this work, not only with septic to sewers, but also with some of the different funding opportunities and research priorities and activities that are through the state. And so we were really looking at how we were going to prioritize some of these efforts, and how legacy nutrients might be addressed as well. And then back to the models, what kind of modeling efforts that could be pursued to see, if we did these septic to sewer conversions, what would some of the nutrient reductions be in this case? So it really comes down to, trying to find the hot spots, if you will. What's the worst of the worst? And maybe we should be addressing those first. And trying to couple that with the biggest bang for the buck. Where would the best investments be? As we all know, sometimes the biggest problems are also the most complex problems. So maybe we can't address those first. For example, with the Innovative Technologies program, we're learning a lot. And as Ed mentioned, there's going to be some trial and error in there. So maybe we do need to pick some of these lower hanging fruits where we can get the experience and get the data coming in, that then we can start applying to more and more complex problems. Next slide, please. So that's a brief summary here, but basically, if we take kind of a 10,000-foot level on this, a lot of funding has been provided through the state. A lot of these are grants programs, either for research on innovative technologies or for septic to sewer conversions. Technical advisory committees have been constructed and put together to really get into some of these issues, for example, with septic to sewer, as well as stormwater. more work needs to be done. And really it's focusing on prioritizing the targets. And a lot of this should be data driven. And what would the plans of action be then on these fronts? So that's where we've been really, I guess, circling back to would be how are we going to prioritize all of this? Or how will the DEP or the state of Florida prioritize this? And what is the plan of action going to be? So again, a kind of a brief overview. Our next meeting we're trying to schedule, we canceled a May meeting this month. And so we're trying to reschedule for later in the summer, hopefully, before September or October, when with the elections and things like that, things start to get a little heated. So we're hoping to get our next meeting in probably in the next 2 or 3 months. So that's all I have. So thank you very much.
Any questions for Dr. Parsons? Yes, Deanna.
I have a couple of questions. The first one is, you talked quite a bit about the septic to sewer conversions. I didn't hear anything about advanced septic or nitrogen reducing systems. So was that part of the consideration? And then my second question is, you talk about more work needing to be done. Is there any preliminary work on identifying and prioritizing these targets for action, or is that going to be further down the line?
Yeah, so the answer to your first question is yes, there were discussions on these advanced systems, and there will be places where those would be most appropriate to use, and maybe even required to use. But by that point, I think we're starting to get into legislative action would be needed to make that required. So we would need a bill put on the floor and then approved and signed by the governor. So would it be better if there was some kind of incentive program? So if we incentivize that for certain areas. Now we know in areas where we have the springs, for example, that'd probably be most likely where we would see either an incentive program or some kind of requirements that we would bump it up. But these systems are expensive and they require, a lot more maintenance than the passive systems that are traditionally used. So I think those are going to be issues that, are going to need to be discussed. What is within DEP's purview right now, or what will require legislative action to give them more regulatory authority, I guess would be one way of saying it, on these issues. So then, it starts to become political when you get into that, and that's where we just don't really have the answers. In terms of your second question, I've lost it. What was the second part of this again?
If you talk about the work needing to be done to identify and prioritize targets for action, is that going to have anything been done to this point that you can talk to, or is that further out and we should wait to hear more about it later? We'll have to wait and hear more about it. The only thing that I have heard from Mark Rains is that the DEP is definitely collecting data. South Florida Water Management is collecting data. They've taken our recommendations to heart, where they've been able to take action directly. Again, was there a need for legislative action or not? But we haven't really seen the results of this more strategic sampling and data analysis effort. So that's one thing that's on the radar for sure. And when Mark Rains asks us what do we want to talk about, that's one thing that we continually bring up is, can we get an update on the strategic sampling and identifying these hot spots or these high priority items. So it's on our radar, but we have not had a good, concise report on that yet. And it might be just because, as they are collecting all these data and doing the data analyses, they're just not ready to present a report on that yet. So fingers crossed. I mean, that's all we can really say here. That's something that we would really like to see, and we'll keep asking for it until it shows up. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, doesn't look like we have any more questions. We'll go ahead and move on. Item number 13,